A warm welcome to the program. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Over the last few days, we've seen the exchange of airstrikes and rockets between the Israeli military and Palestinian militants in Gaza. Despite calls by the international community that the violence stops, there are still no signs of abating. Many civilians have been killed in the airstrikes, including whole families on the side of Gaza. Israel, on the other hand, has not experienced the same number of casualties, with the death toll on that side still in single digits. We'll be looking into the violence, what each side wants, and what the international community can do. My guest this week is a lecturer of media at Brezit University in Ramallah, Palestine, Juman Kunis. She'll be joining us in a bit, but first a quick check on those discussions in diplomatic circles. While the Israeli military continues airstrikes on Hamas targets, forces on Sunday used drones to drop tear gas on Palestinian demonstrators near the Beit El settlement. The specific type of drone was first used by Israeli police at the Gaza border during protests in 2018. Their use on a wider scale was approved by the police in late April, according to Israeli media. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists that destroying the Jallah high-rise block in Gaza on Saturday was justified. He was saying this during an interview on a U.S. network in which he maintained that there was an intelligence office for the Palestinian terrorist organizations housed in that building that plots and organizes terror attacks against Israeli civilians, so it's a perfectly legitimate target. The building in question housed crews from the Associated Press and Al Jazeera, who were given an hour to leave before it was destroyed in an airstrike. Mr. Netanyahu confirmed Israeli reports the U.S. officials had given information about the attack. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has condemned anti-Semitism targeting British Jews following the emergence of a video showing a convoy of cars brandishing Palestinian flags in North London, with anti-Semitic abuse apparently being shouted through a megaphone. Opposition leader Keir Starmer tweeted, "Anti-Semitism, misogyny and hate have no place in our streets or in our society." The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, said he was deeply concerned by reports of hateful, intimidating and racist language used on marches and social media. He said behavior that incites anti-Jewish or anti-Muslim hatred has no place in our city. You've seen the headlines, the fighting, the violence, the deaths going on in Gaza, the buildings collapsing under airstrikes and Israeli rockets. And you've seen the Israelis run for cover as sirens blast, warning people to get to the nearest bunker shelter. What is really going on between the two?
A week after the start of the worst outbreak of Israeli-Palestinian violence in years, the exchange of airstrikes is yet to stop. The death toll in Gaza continues to rise, reaching over 180 as of Saturday, including over 50 children. Hamas began its rocket assault on Monday, May the 10th, after weeks of tensions over a court case to evict Palestinian families in East Jerusalem, and in retaliation for Israeli police clashes with Palestinians near the city's Al-Aqsa Mosque, Islam's third holiest site during the Muslim month of Ramadan. Both Israel and Hamas said they will continue their cross-border fire after Israel destroyed a 12-story building in Gaza City on Saturday that housed the U.S. Associated Press and Qatar-based Al Jazeera media operations. The Israeli military says the Al Jallah building was a legitimate military target containing Hamas military officers and that it had given advance warnings to civilians to get out of the building. On Sunday morning, Palestinians in Gaza searched for their wounded under rubble and debris. Israel said it had bombed the home of Hamas's chief in Gaza, and sirens warning of rocket attacks sounded in Israeli border towns shortly after dawn. In a burst of airstrikes early Sunday, the Israeli military said it struck the home of Yahya Sinwar in the southern Gaza city of Khan Yunis. Sinwar, who was released from an Israeli prison in 2011, heads the political and military wings of Hamas in Gaza. As international calls for an end to the violence increases, the UN Security Council met on Sunday. Secretary General Antonio Guterres described hostilities in Israel and Gaza as utterly appalling. Opening the Council's first public meeting on the conflict, Guterres said the United Nations is actively engaging all sides towards an immediate ceasefire and called on them to allow mediation efforts to intensify and succeed.
I appeal to all parties to heed this call. The United Nations is actively engaging all sides towards an immediate ceasefire. The hostilities have already caused unconscionable death, immense suffering, and damage to vital infrastructure. I'm appalled by the increasingly large number of Palestinian civilian casualties, including many women and children, from Israeli strikes in Gaza. And I also deplore Israeli fatalities from rockets launched from Gaza.
Representatives of the Israeli and Palestinian governments were present at the council meeting.
Israel keeps telling you, put yourself in our shoes. This is what they say all the time. Put yourself in our shoes. But Israel is not wearing shoes. It is wearing military boots. It is an occupying and a colonial power.
Hamas targets civilians. Israel targets terrorists. Israel makes every effort to avoid civilian casualties. Hamas makes every effort to increase civilian casualties. Israel sees every civilian death as a tragedy. Hamas sees every Israeli civilian death as a victory in its campaign of jihad based on its anti-Semitic charter, and every Palestinian civilian death as a victory in its campaign to gain international sympathy.
Present at the meeting is the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who made it clear to Israel, the Palestinians and others that it is ready to offer support should the parties seek a ceasefire to end the worsening violence.
It is critical all parties return to working in good faith toward the vision of Israel and a Palestinian state, living side by side in peace, within secure and recognized borders in which both Israelis and Palestinians enjoy equal measures of freedom, security, prosperity, and democracy. But right now, children are terrified, and we need to do everything we can to move closer to a day when both Israeli and Palestinian children wake up every morning without fearing for their lives.
Even Pope Francis has called for an end to the conflict, saying the deaths of so many innocent people in recent days, including children, was unacceptable. Pro-Palestinian protests are growing globally to denounce Israeli offensive in Gaza and recent expulsions in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem.
Joining me now is my guest. She's a lecturer at Birzeit University in Ramallah, Palestine, where she lives. Germaine Kunis, it's great to see you again. Thanks for joining me.
You're more than welcome.
It's been years since the last time we spoke, and I'm glad you're doing okay.
Yeah, it's fine.
Now, you live in Ramallah, which is just 104 kilometers from the Gaza Strip. 83 if you're going by air travel. What's the reaction there to what is going on in Gaza?
Yeah, as you mentioned, although the short distance between Ramallah and Gaza, I'm following what's happening in Gaza among the TV channels only, because I, as Palestinian, I'm not allowed to go to Gaza at all, even if I'm a journalist. Even before the war on Gaza Strip, I'm not neither allowed to go to Jerusalem because I'm Palestinian who holds West Bank identity. I should get a permission to go to the Palestinian cities as Gaza. They give permissions only to people in very restricted cases. But according to the call with people in Gaza, the situation actually is much worse than we all see on the screens of TV. This early morning, for example, 27 Palestinian civilians were killed under the rubble of the homes leveled to the ground last night by Israeli warplanes in the neighborhood of Rimal in Gaza City, of course. Among these victims, 52 children and 31 women. The number could rise, of course, because the civil defense teams are searching for more people who might be trapped under the rubble of houses. The latest Israeli airstrikes caused significant damage actually to the infrastructure of the neighborhood mentioned, Arimal, including electricity networks, the roads, and I would like to mention the roads, especially to the central hospital of Gaza called Ashifa. Therefore, the ambulances couldn't reach or go to the hospitals because of this damage.
And that's where the concern is, isn't it, Juman? The fact that innocent people are being killed, in these airstrikes. You just mentioned 53 children dying in one day. And then we know that more people we're seeing, from the pictures that we're seeing, and you tell us that the pictures are a lot different from where you're standing. We're seeing destruction of buildings, heartbreaking stories of families that are lost, just people looking for just only one member of the family who's alive, and so on. And that's because Israeli military is being deployed, and they're even firing rockets on the ground. So how much worse do you think that this could get?
It will getting worse if people all over the world will stay silent, actually, because Israel feels like it's free in doing all of these, continuing airstrikes against Gaza. Not only this, to be honest, the airstrikes are not the only thing that Israelis are doing. Since Friday, more than 11 Palestinians were killed here in West Bank. Ramallah, Bethlehem, Tulkarem, Qalqilia, and more than 100 people were wounded by the Israeli occupation forces. The situation is very, very bad and horrible in Gaza, but even in West Bank, it's very deteriorated also, and we have a lot of victims here. Today, there were many funerals for young people who were killed by Israeli settlers and Israeli forces also.
And this violence that we're talking about today all stems from tensions between Israel and Palestine in East Jerusalem and Israel's annexation plans, and of course the clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Could you paint a clearer picture about why the world is watching this crisis unfold, why there's tension between Israel and Palestine, especially with Hamas?
Maybe I disagree, my dear, with you. Not all of the world is unfold. We have a lot of friends around all over the world. People who believe deeply in human rights, in equality and justice. Countries who are unfold are only those who have interests with Israel, unfortunately. Political, military interests and strategic maybe, and also ambitions in Middle East. Unfortunately, interest, as you know, maybe mean standing on the side of the powerful party, not the side of the rightful one. We believe that our strength lies in our right to live in dignity. This is what we are trying to show to the world. There are many examples of people, as you know, who was liberated from occupation, such as Vietnam and South Africa. I believe that one day we will be free like these peoples, even if the world remains idle.
My conversation with Juman Kounis continues after the break. Please stay with us. You think this can be likened to apartheid? Because some groups have mentioned that what's happening with the Gaza Strip can be akin to apartheid in South Africa. Some have described it as genocide.
Yes, of course. Yes, because there is killing of a lot of people, of hundreds of people, of thousands of them are now without homes. They are homeless, and in addition to all of what you mentioned, we have the wall, which is much longer and higher than the wall built in Berlin 70 years ago. So all of these violations of human rights could be described as apartheid or a violation of human rights.
So, Juman, we've seen those pro-Palestinian protests holding around the world, in the US, in the UK, in Tunisia, even in South Africa. You have pro-Palestinian protests calling on Israel to stop the airstrikes, to stop the violence in Gaza and in East Jerusalem. And it appears that the focus is shifting, to calls for Palestinians to have their own land, for independence of Palestine, for a two-state solution. We've heard that a few times coming up. Do you also have the opinion that this should be thrashed out now, that this is a time that Palestine really needs to emphasize, its own independence and ask Israel to respect that?
It should not be thrashed out now. I mean, like Israel stopped talking about this solution 20 years ago, few years after peace agreements in 1993. I will tell you why. According to Oslo Agreement, the Palestinians should have their state on the land occupied by Israel in 1967, with East Jerusalem as a capital. But what happened? Israel confiscated more than 60% from the land that was meant to be the state of Palestine. And Israel built an apartheid wall around it, and it divided the Palestinian land into isolated geographic chunks. It refused to make East Jerusalem the capital of Palestine. It seized all the sources of gas and water, controlled our borders, set checkpoints on the entrance of each city, refraining us from collecting our olives, cultivating our lands, and hundreds of violations against the unarmed people. So I think that this options was forgotten many years ago because of what's happening on the ground.
Let's talk about the international community's involvement, Juman. World leaders are calling for an end to the violence. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has called for immediate de-escalation and cessation of hostilities in Gaza and in Israel. The US has an envoy meeting with leaders of both sides and the UN. But in times like this, there is distrust on both sides, and it is a question of, who's willing to put down their weapons. Who would Palestine consider friends at this time, and who would they say have their best interests at heart?
Who put down weapons? I think the party who raised the weapon at Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and Al-Aqsa Mosque. I don't think that Palestinian people chooses the war at all, neither Hamas. For the Friends of Palestine, I think the answer is the millions of people who are holding protests all over the world. People who believe in human rights, who believe in justice, and I think they are huge numbers. And we hope that they will make pressure on their governments just to have their say, to have their words against what's happening in Gaza and Palestine in total.
Yeah, so it is established. The violence started with Israeli police trying to evacuate people around the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But then the first airstrikes came from Gaza. They came from Hamas, not from Israel.
From Hamas, yes, but maybe
because
I think
that would mean that Hamas started this exchange of airstrikes. This really wasn't Israel's call. This was Hamas who started off the airstrikes, and Israel was only defending itself, because that's what Israel says, and that's what the rest of the world sees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree with you. People are not looking at the reason why it started or from where it started, but the real reason that it started from Sheikh Jarrah where hundreds of Palestinian families were attacked to be evicted from their homes and replaced by Israeli settlers. I think it started from Al-Aqsa Mosque, where worshippers were assaulted and fired by Israeli soldiers. It started when Israeli forces prevented people, worshippers, during Ramadan month from entering Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is where this violence started. But unfortunately, the Israeli propaganda succeeded to show or portray that the problem or the violation started from the Hamas missiles, which is not true at all.
Yeah, but you know, Juman, it is unfortunate that Hamas militants are actually living amongst the civilian population in Gaza, unfortunately. And that's why there are more casualties in that part of the world than on the Israeli side. Would you really blame Israel for actually targeting, the people it considers as its enemies?
If they consider Hamas as enemies, I don't think that they consider Hamas as enemies. They consider the whole Palestinian people as enemies. Unfortunately, people who are living peacefully in these buildings, which were destroyed yesterday and in the last 3 days, all of them are civilians. All of them are unarmed. I think that the Israeli army is very very developed, and they know well from where the missiles are coming. But they are destroying the building, and they know well that there are innocent and unarmed people there. Gaza Strip is very crowded, the most crowded geographic point in the world. So they have to know that well. And I think that they can avoid the civilians, but this is what didn't happen because they want to make pressure on Hamas. This is my point of view, and this is what Palestinian people think.
So you would support a two-state solution to end this crisis?
Of course, but is it true? I'm not sure that it's really true, but because on the ground it's very difficult to imagine after Israel confiscated a lot of distance of land, of Palestinian land, and after it built the wall on the Palestinian land. I think it's not realistic to talk about two states because of what's happening on the ground. If there is a real willing from the Israeli side, maybe in the future they can do that, but they have to stop rising the number of settlements in Palestinian land, and they have to have the real willing to negotiate with Palestinians and give them their rights.
Juman, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you. I know you're risking a lot being right here on TV, telling me things happening in your own country. We're all praying for a peaceful resolution to this crisis, for peace on both sides. And our thoughts and prayers, of course, are with those who've lost families and those who've lost children and loved ones in this crisis.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And that's the program this week. If you missed anything on the show, you can always watch it again. Head on to the channel's television website, search for Diplomatic Channel under Programs, and click on this edition. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.